Did you ever wonder if medieval women only stayed home and embroidered tapestries? What if everything you thought you knew about knights, castles, and combat in the Middle Ages, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries, was missing a crucial piece? We are diving deep into the true stories of medieval European women and the wild myths that still swirl around them. Number 7. Women fought only in defense of their homes, never offensively or as part of organized armies. The popular story often limits medieval women to defending their hearth and home if they fought at all. It paints a picture where their engagement in warfare was purely reactive, a desperate last stand within the confines of a besieged castle. This narrative suggests that women might protect their immediate dwelling, but never venture out, never lead, and certainly never initiate conflict or join larger military campaigns. The idea of a woman strategically planning an offensive, commanding troops on a long march, or participating in a siege on enemy territory simply does not fit this limited view. Yet, the historical record tells a far more dynamic and often brutal story, one where the lines between defense and offense blurred, and women stepped across them with surprising regularity. Think about Jeanne de Clisson, a figure whose very existence shatters this particular myth. After her husband was executed by the French king in the mid-14th century, a betrayal that left her seething with a thirst for vengeance, Jeanne did not retreat to a quiet life of mourning within a castle. Instead, she took her 2 young sons, sold her lands, and used the proceeds to purchase 3 warships. These vessels she painted black with blood-red sails, earning them the terrifying moniker of the Black Fleet. She became a pirate, a Countess of Brittany, relentlessly preying on French shipping in the English Channel. Her campaigns were far from defensive, they were calculated, offensive strikes aimed at disrupting French trade and military movements. She personally led raids, boarded enemy ships, and reportedly executed noble French captives with her own axe, leaving only a few survivors to carry her chilling message back to the king. This was not the defense of a home, it was a sustained, strategic campaign of revenge, commanded and executed by a woman who chose the open, violent seas as her battlefield. Her actions demonstrate a proactive, aggressive military engagement beyond any domestic boundary. Look further back to Countess Matilda of Tuscany, a powerful ruler in the 11th and early 12th centuries in what is now Italy. Matilda was no mere regent or figurehead. She inherited vast territories and, like any powerful lord of her time, commanded significant military forces. Her reign was marked by intense political and military conflicts, most notably with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV during the investiture controversy. Matilda did not wait for her lands to be attacked. She actively led her armies in numerous campaigns, often engaging in offensive maneuvers to protect her strategic interests, consolidate her power, or enforce her will. She was present on battlefields, directed troops, and proved herself a formidable military strategist. Her forces engaged in open combat, sieges, and counterattacks, all under her direct command. This was not a woman huddled behind castle walls. This was a sovereign who actively waged war, participating in the broader, offensive military landscape of her era. Even within the context of the Crusades, often portrayed as a solely male endeavor, women played roles that extended beyond mere support. While Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, traveled on the Second Crusade, her involvement was far from passive. She brought her own armed retinue, dressed in armor, and wielded immense political and financial influence over the campaign. While her direct combat role is debated by some historians, her presence and authority were deeply entwined with the military operations. She held court with commanders, influenced strategy, and provided crucial resources. Her journey was part of a massive organized offensive religious war, not a localized defense. Many other women, too, participated in the Crusades, sometimes as camp followers, sometimes as active participants in battles, particularly during the chaotic People's Crusade, where women were among the ranks facing combat. The reality of these large-scale movements meant that women were often part of the offensive thrust, not merely static defenders. Consider Isabella of Castile, the formidable queen regnant who, alongside her husband Ferdinand, unified Spain in the late 15th century. Isabella was deeply involved in the final stages of the Reconquista, the long struggle to drive the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Her role was not limited to courtly affairs or diplomacy. She personally oversaw the logistics of the Granada War, a massive and prolonged military undertaking. She visited army camps, inspected troops, managed supplies, and even appeared on battlefields, embodying a direct leadership role in a major offensive campaign. Her chroniclers describe her involvement in the strategic planning and execution of the war, her presence boosting morale, and her decisions shaping military outcomes. She was a crucial figure in the organized offensive conquest of Granada, dismantling any notion that women were confined to purely defensive roles. These examples, from a privateering vengeful noblewoman to powerful queens leading national armies and engaging in international religious wars, demonstrate that the idea of women solely defending their homes is a narrow and often inaccurate portrayal of medieval reality. Women, driven by personal grievance, political ambition, religious fervor, or pure necessity, participated in offensive actions, commanded forces, and shaped the course of military history in ways that directly challenged the simplistic idea of their limited involvement. The complex tapestry of medieval warfare shows women as active agents capable of initiating and leading military campaigns beyond the walls of their immediate dwelling. Number 6. Female knights were always aristocratic and exceptional. The prevailing narrative often confines the idea of a female warrior or knight to the upper echelons of society. It suggests that if a woman ever picked up a sword, she must have been a countess, a queen, or an extraordinarily unique individual like Joan of Arc, set apart by birth, immense wealth, or divine inspiration. This perspective implies that ordinary women, those from the peasant class, the urban artisans, or the burgeoning middle class, were utterly excluded from any form of martial activity. The notion is that only the privileged few had the resources for training, the lineage to command, or the societal standing to even conceive of such a role. This myth overlooks the harsh realities of medieval life for the vast majority of the population, where survival often demanded courage and practical skills, regardless of social status. When a medieval town or castle faced a siege, the defense was a communal effort. Chronicles and archaeological evidence from sites like the Siege of Calais in the 14th century or countless other lesser-known sieges reveal that men and women from all social strata participated in the defense. This was not just about noble women directing affairs from the keep. Common women, often alongside their male counterparts, would haul stones, buckets of hot water, burning pitch, or even human waste to throw down upon attackers from the ramparts. They would operate siege engines, reload crossbows, and sometimes even engage in direct hand-to-hand combat if the walls were breached. A description from the Siege of Sens in the 12th century mentions women fighting alongside men on the walls, displaying remarkable bravery. These were not aristocratic knights in the traditional sense, but ordinary women thrust into extraordinary circumstances, whose survival depended on their active participation in the fight. Their roles were often physically demanding and critical to the defense, demonstrating that martial capability was not exclusive to the elite. The tumultuous political landscape of the Middle Ages also saw numerous peasant revolts and urban uprisings. During events like the Jacquerie in France in the mid-14th century, or the English Peasants' Revolt in 1381, women were active and often violent participants. They marched with the rebels, engaged in acts of destruction, and sometimes even fought alongside the men against local lords or royal forces. In contemporary accounts, though often hostile to the rebels, acknowledge the presence and involvement of women in the fighting. These were not women of noble birth trained in formal combat. They were common folk driven by desperation and a desire for justice, taking up whatever weapons were at hand, pitchforks, axes, knives, and demonstrating a willingness to engage in direct conflict. Their participation underscores that the capacity for martial action was not limited by social class. Beyond organized conflict, records sometimes hint at women involved in less savory, but equally physical, activities like banditry and highway robbery. While documentation is sparse, for obvious reasons, occasional legal records or criminal confessions reveal women who were part of outlaw gangs, who were armed, and who actively participated in violent acts to secure their livelihood. These were women operating entirely outside the aristocratic sphere, proving that the ability to handle weapons and engage in combat was not confined to those born into privilege. Survival in the rugged and often lawless parts of medieval society could demand such skills from anyone, regardless of their station. Even among the camp followers who trailed medieval armies, a diverse group, often comprising laundresses, cooks, prostitutes, and merchants, there are instances where women took up arms. In the chaotic aftermath of battles or during skirmishes, these women might defend themselves, scavenge, or even participate in opportunistic violence. Their roles were born of necessity and the brutal realities of war, not from aristocratic training or formal titles. The sheer physicality of medieval life, from farming to managing a household, meant that women of all classes developed significant strength and resilience. A woman accustomed to wielding an axe for splitting wood, or a heavy pestle for grinding grain, already possessed a degree of physical capability and familiarity with practical tools that could easily be turned into weapons in a desperate situation. The line between a tool and a weapon was often fluid, and women across the social spectrum knew how to handle them. Therefore, the idea that female warriors or knights were exclusively aristocratic exceptions misses a crucial aspect of medieval society. While noble women might have had more formal training and more prominent roles, the sheer volume of women from all walks of life who participated in violent conflicts, whether in communal defense, rebellion, or even outlawry, paints a much broader picture. Their actions demonstrate that martial ability, courage, and the necessity to fight were not exclusive privileges of the elite, but fundamental aspects of survival for many medieval women, regardless of their birthright. Number 5. Women only fought disguised as men. A persistent and often romanticized myth suggests that if a woman ever engaged in combat in the Middle Ages, she must have done so by concealing her true gender, donning men's clothing and armor to pass as a male warrior. This narrative implies that open female participation in warfare was unthinkable, that society would not tolerate it, and that any woman who dared to fight had to become invisible as a woman to do so. This image of the cross-dressing warrior woman certainly exists in both historical accounts and literature, but it is far from the whole story. While disguise offered anonymity, safety, or access to male-dominated spaces, many women fought openly, their gender known and sometimes even celebrated, in roles recognized for them, or simply as themselves without any attempt at concealment. Consider the numerous accounts of women participating in siege defense, as discussed earlier. These were not secret operations conducted by disguised individuals. When a castle or town was under attack, every able-bodied person, male or female, was often pressed into service. Chroniclers frequently describe women openly on the ramparts, hurling stones, pouring hot pitch, or firing crossbows alongside men. For instance, at the Siege of Montargis in 1427, a detailed account by Christine de Pizan, a contemporary writer, describes the active participation of women, led by a local woman named Jeanne, in defending the town. These women were not disguised, they were known as women, recognized for their bravery and their essential contributions to the defense. Their presence was not hidden, but a testament to the collective effort required to repel attackers. Noblewomen, who commanded armies or defended their castles, rarely did so in disguise. Joanna of Flanders, the Countess of Montfort, provides a compelling example from the 14th century War of the Breton Succession. When her husband was captured, she did not withdraw. Instead, she donned armor, rode among her troops, and personally led the defense of her castle at Hennebont against the French besiegers. She is famously recorded rallying her troops, leading a sortie to burn enemy siege engines, and inspiring unwavering loyalty. She was known as Jeanne la Flamme, Joan the Fiery, her gender openly recognized, and her martial prowess celebrated by her allies and acknowledged by her enemies. She was a powerful female leader on the battlefield, not a hidden one. Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany, similarly did not disguise her gender. As mentioned earlier, her legendary status as a pirate queen was intrinsically linked to her identity as a woman seeking vengeance. Her enemies knew her gender, and it was part of her terrifying mystique. She commanded her ships, engaged in naval combat, and inflicted brutal justice, all while being known as a female leader. Her gender was not a secret, but a defining characteristic of her formidable reputation. The very concept of a dame guerrière, or chevaleresses in medieval texts, also suggests an open recognition of women who fulfilled roles analogous to knights. While not a widespread formal title, the existence of such terms implies that women were understood to be capable of, and sometimes engaged in martial activities without needing to hide their sex. The story of Guda, the female knight from the Chronicle of Rothe in the 12th century, describes her overtly as a woman warrior, celebrated for her strength and skill, not for her ability to pass as a man. While historical figures like Joan of Arc did wear male attire, often for practical reasons like riding astride or for safety, as well as perhaps symbolic ones, her identity as a woman was never truly hidden. Her contemporaries and enemies knew she was a woman. Her very uniqueness stemmed from her gender combined with her military leadership. She was an openly female commander whose power and influence came from her perceived divine mandate, not from successful deception about her sex. The idea that women only fought disguised as men simplifies a complex reality. Disguise was a tactic, a means to an end for some women, but it was not a universal prerequisite for female participation in medieval warfare. Many women fought openly, their courage and ferocity recognized by their peers and chronicled for posterity, proving that the battlefield, in various capacities, was not always an exclusively male domain. Their open participation shatters the notion that their gender always had to be hidden for them to engage in combat. Number 4. Female knights were just a literary trope, not real. A common misconception is that the idea of a female knight or warrior in the Middle Ages was purely a figment of medieval imagination, confined to the pages of chivalric romances and epic poems. This myth suggests that figures like the Amazonian queens or valiant maidens battling alongside male heroes were nothing more than fantastical inventions, delightful fictions with no grounding in historical reality. It implies that the concept of a woman wielding a sword or leading troops was too outlandish for the practical, patriarchal medieval world, and thus could only exist in the realm of myth and storytelling. However, while medieval literature certainly embraced the heroic female warrior, these fictional portrayals often drew inspiration from, or at least reflected, a societal understanding that women could and did engage in martial activities. The lines between historical accounts and legendary tales were often fluid, and the existence of real women who fought gives context to the popular trope. Chivalric romances, immensely popular in the Middle Ages, are indeed filled with powerful female warriors, Bradamante and Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, Camilla and Virgil's Aeneid, though classical, influential in medieval thought, or countless unnamed heroines who defend castles or avenge wrongs. These characters, with their improbable strength and martial skill, certainly capture the imagination. However, their very presence in these widely consumed stories indicates that the concept of a female warrior was not entirely foreign or repugnant to the medieval mind. It suggests a cultural space where such an idea could take root, even if exaggerated for dramatic effect. If the idea of a fighting woman were utterly alien, these tropes might not have resonated with audiences as they clearly did. The tales might have served as an aspiration or a distorted reflection of real-world possibilities. Moreover, the medieval engagement with the classical Amazons, a race of female warriors, was complex. Medieval scholars and chroniclers debated their existence, sometimes placing them in real geographic locations on maps or in historical accounts. This wasn't always seen as pure fantasy for some, it was a historical enigma to be discussed. This intellectual wrestling with the Amazon myth further suggests that the concept of female-only warrior societies, or simply women warriors, was not entirely dismissed as impossible or solely mythological by everyone. It indicates a willingness to consider such possibilities, even if in a distant or legendary context. Crucially, many of the real historical figures we have already discussed, like Jeanne de Clisson or Joanna of Flanders, often had elements of legend built around them. Their extraordinary courage and actions were sometimes embellished by chroniclers and popular memory, turning them into figures of awe and inspiration. But the core actions leading troops, defending castles, engaging in warfare, were historically attested. The overlap between historical fact and developing legend shows how real women's martial prowess could become the stuff of stories, rather than the other way around. The chroniclers like Jeanne Froissart, who meticulously documented the Hundred Years' War, described women actively participating in sieges and battles, treating these accounts as factual events, not as mere literary devices. He reported on the actions of women like Joanna of Flanders with seriousness, not as if he were recounting fiction. Beyond literary chronicles, legal documents, wills, and administrative records sometimes provide glimpses of women's practical involvement in military affairs. A will might mention a woman's ownership of weapons, or a feudal document might detail a woman's obligation to raise troops for her land. These are not literary inventions, but mundane historical artifacts that reflect a reality where women could possess and even use implements of war. For instance, the very existence of the Order of the Hatchet in 12th century Catalonia, an order reportedly created to honor women who defended Tortosa from a Moorish siege, bestowing upon them specific privileges, provides a tangible example of formal recognition for women's martial contributions, rooted in a real-world event. This was not a literary club, it was a civic honor. The persistence of this myth often stems from a modern tendency to separate strict historical reality from narrative tradition, but in the Middle Ages, the two were often intertwined. The tales of valiant maidens did not emerge from a vacuum. They likely resonated precisely because there were real, albeit perhaps fewer, instances of women engaging in martial roles. The literary trope of the female warrior was not an isolated fantasy, but a reflection, however distorted, of a society where women sometimes had to, and did, take up arms, proving that the idea of a fighting woman was not merely a convenient plot device, but a possibility drawn from the complex realities of the medieval world. Number 3. Chivalry protected women from all warfare, making combat unnecessary for them. This myth paints a picture of medieval warfare as a polite, regulated affair where a strict code of chivalry ensured that women were always protected, never harmed, and certainly never needed to engage in combat themselves. It conjures images of gallant knights defending their ladies, shielding them from the brutality of battle, and ensuring their complete safety from the horrors of war. According to this view, the very existence of chivalry rendered it unnecessary, even unthinkable, for a woman to pick up a weapon or face an enemy, as male warriors would always step in to offer complete protection. This romanticized notion fundamentally misunderstands the brutal realities of medieval warfare and the actual, often limited, application of chivalric ideals. Chivalry, while an important concept, was primarily an ideal, a set of aspirational behaviors for a specific social class, the knightly aristocracy. It was rarely a universal practice that governed all interactions in times of war. The medieval period was characterized by immense violence, and war was often indiscriminate, affecting entire populations regardless of age, gender, or social standing. When armies marched, they frequently lived off the land, plundering villages, burning crops, and terrorizing the populace. Women were often targets of rape, abduction, and murder during these campaigns. Far from being universally protected, they were profoundly vulnerable. The rules of war, as we might understand them today, were nascent and often ignored in practice. Brutality was common, and chivalric codes were often selectively applied, if at all, especially to commoners or those considered enemies. The most glaring challenge to this myth comes from the omnipresent reality of siege warfare. Castles and towns were often the primary targets in medieval conflicts. When a stronghold was besieged, everyone inside, men, women, and children, was trapped and at risk. There was no chivalric exemption for women from starvation, disease, or direct assault if the walls were breached. In such desperate situations, women were not merely passive recipients of protection. They actively participated in the defense, often alongside men throwing stones, pouring hot water or oil, or preparing and reloading projectiles. Accounts from the siege of Castle Gallard in the early 13th century describe non-combatants, including women and children, being expelled from the castle to preserve supplies, only to be left to starve in the freezing cold between the lines, demonstrating the brutal lack of protection in extreme circumstances. Their very presence on the ramparts or their suffering outside the walls highlights that protection was not always an option, and fighting for survival was a necessity. Even noblewomen, who theoretically benefited most from chivalric ideals, were far from immune. While a noble lady might be ransomed rather than killed if captured, this was by no means guaranteed, and it certainly did not preclude her from being taken captive, held in harsh conditions, or suffering other forms of indignity. The English Queen Margaret of Anjou, a powerful figure during the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, did not rely on chivalry to protect her. Instead, she actively raised armies, led her forces into battle, and fought for her dynastic claims. Her leadership was driven by necessity and ambition, a testament to the fact that even for the most high-born women, relying solely on male protection was often insufficient or impossible. For the vast majority of medieval women, survival in a violent era often meant being prepared to defend oneself or one's community. If men were away fighting, or dead, or incapacitated, women often had to take up arms to protect their homes, families, and lives. This was not a choice, it was a desperate measure dictated by the realities of a world where violence was endemic. The idealized image of chivalry belonged to a specific segment of society and was often honored in the breach. It did not create a protective bubble for all women, making combat universally unnecessary for them. The historical record clearly shows that medieval women, facing the harsh realities of warfare, frequently had to fight for their lives and their communities, regardless of any idealized code. Number 2. Women couldn't fight or handle weapons. This myth asserts that medieval women were physically incapable of engaging in combat or effectively wielding weapons. It often rests on modern assumptions about female physical strength relative to men, projecting these assumptions onto a past era without fully understanding the nuances of medieval combat or the physical realities of medieval life for women. The idea is that medieval warfare demanded immense brute strength, and since women were seen as the weaker sex, they simply could not participate meaningfully in battle, nor could they master the complex skills required to handle swords, spears, or bows. This perspective overlooks the practicalities of weapon use in the Middle Ages, the widespread physical demands of daily life for all people, and the historical evidence of women's physical capabilities and training. Medieval combat, contrary to many popular depictions, was not always about pure brute force. While strength was certainly an advantage, skill, technique, leverage, agility, and precise timing were often far more critical in determining the outcome of a fight. A well-placed thrust with a spear, a practiced cut with a sword, or an accurately aimed arrow relied more on training and precision than on overwhelming muscle. Many medieval weapons, such as daggers, short swords, or even certain types of polearms, could be effectively wielded by individuals of varying builds and physical strengths, provided they had the necessary training. A common misconception is that all medieval armor was impossibly heavy, while full-plate armor was indeed cumbersome. Many fighters wore lighter forms of protection, like padded arming coats, mail shirts, or leather, which were far less restrictive and more widely accessible. The daily life of a medieval woman, particularly outside the highest echelons of nobility, was physically demanding. Peasant women worked in fields, hauled water, milled grain, and performed countless strenuous tasks. Noble women often managed large households, which involved significant physical labor and coordination. This constant physical activity meant that medieval women, in general, possessed a level of strength and stamina often underestimated by modern standards. A woman accustomed to wielding a heavy washboard, an axe for chopping firewood, or a sickle for harvesting crops already possessed a degree of practical physical capability and familiarity with tool manipulation that could be directly transferable to the use of weapons in a defensive or offensive scenario. The line between a farming tool and a weapon was often blurred. Furthermore, evidence suggests that girls and young women in noble households, especially those who might inherit property or rule in their own right, sometimes received training that included physical conditioning and skills transferable to warfare. They might learn to ride horses with proficiency, which was crucial for medieval mobility and combat. Or hunting, a common pastime for the aristocracy, involved skills like archery, tracking, and handling knives, all of which had martial applications. While not formal military drills, these activities provided a foundational level of physical literacy and weapon familiarity. For instance, the ability to ride a horse well was essential for any leader, male or female, on the battlefield. Archaeological finds, though often difficult to interpret definitively, sometimes offer tantalizing clues. Skeletons of women from medieval burial sites, including some associated with violent deaths or battle sites, occasionally show evidence of musculature or injuries consistent with physical activity and trauma that could relate to combat. While such evidence does not definitively prove extensive female participation in fighting, it challenges the notion of universal female physical fragility. The very fact that women are recorded participating in siege defense, hauling heavy projectiles to the ramparts and throwing them down, demonstrates a practical physical capability that directly contradicts the myth of universal weakness. The idea that women couldn't fight or handle weapons is largely a projection of later societal norms and modern understandings of gender roles onto a different historical context. The reality was that medieval women were physically capable, often trained in practical skills that had martial applications, and when necessity demanded it, they absolutely could and did wield weapons and engage in combat, proving their physical and mental resilience on the battlefield. Number 1. Female knights never existed. This is perhaps the most pervasive and stubborn myth, firmly lodged in the popular imagination, the idea that women simply did not, or could not, hold the esteemed and militaristic status of a knight in the Middle Ages. The image of the knight is so strongly associated with masculinity, chivalry, and a specific dubbing ceremony performed by men, that the notion of a female knight seems an utter contradiction, a modern fantasy imposed upon history. This myth suggests that any woman who might have fought was an anomaly, a literary invention, or simply someone who acted like a knight but never truly was one. It implies that the title, the role, and the very concept of knighthood were exclusive domains, strictly barred to women. However, historical evidence, though perhaps not abundant in formal dubbing ceremonies for women, clearly points to women who held equivalent military status, commanded forces, were referred to in terms that signify knighthood, and effectively functioned as knights in every practical sense. While the formal dubbing ceremony, where a man was tapped on the shoulder with a sword and sworn into knighthood, was indeed typically a male-dominated ritual, the function and status of a knight were often broader and more fluid than this singular ceremony suggests. A knight was a warrior, a leader of men, a landholder with feudal obligations, and a member of an elite social class. As women, particularly noble women, could embody all of these attributes. Many noble women inherited or managed vast estates, which came with the feudal duty to raise and command troops in times of war. They were, by virtue of their land and lineage, de facto military leaders responsible for the defense of their territories and the provision of military service to their suzerain. Consider the intriguing and rare, yet direct, evidence from the 12th century Chronicle of Roth. This chronicle explicitly mentions Guda, a female knight. The text describes her strength, her skill, and her martial prowess, giving her the title of knight, or a very close equivalent in the original Latin or German like Milites or Ritterin. This is not an interpretation, it is a direct contemporary reference. While such explicit naming is uncommon, its very existence shatters the absolute claim that female knights never existed. It demonstrates that at least in some contexts, the concept was understood and applied. Joanna of Flanders, the Countess of Montfort, as mentioned earlier, was a warrior who effectively functioned as a knight in every practical sense during the 14th century War of the Breton Succession. She was not a knight in the sense of having gone through a formal dubbing ceremony, but she wore armor, rode into battle, personally led troops, and inspired her forces in a way that epitomized the active leadership of a knight. She was described by chroniclers as a lioness and praised for her manly courage, a common trope used to acknowledge a woman's martial prowess within the societal framework of the time. Her actions were those of a military commander, a knightly leader. Another compelling piece of evidence, though debated in its specifics, is the Order of the Hatchet Orden de la Hacha in Catalonia, reportedly founded in the 12th century by Count Raymond Berenguer IV. This order was said to honor women who played a crucial role in defending the city of Tortosa from a Moorish siege in 1149. These women were granted remarkable privileges, including precedence over men in public assemblies, and even the right to wear men's attire at public functions. While not a knightly order in the traditional sense of dubbing female knights, it represents a formal recognition of women's martial contributions and elevated their status based on their military actions, providing them with privileges akin to those enjoyed by male warriors. It acknowledges a specific form of martial honor for women. Even the unique and often misunderstood figure of Joan of Arc in the 15th century, while not formally dubbed as a knight in the traditional sense, functioned precisely as one. She wore armor, carried a banner into battle, personally led French armies to victory, and was a strategic military commander. She embodies the spirit and function of knighthood, despite the peculiarities of her circumstances. Her impact on the 100 Years' War was undeniable, and she stands as a powerful testament to a woman holding supreme military authority and command. The absence of widespread formalized dubbing ceremonies for women should not be conflated with the absence of women who held equivalent military power, status, or identity. The Middle Ages were far more nuanced than a simple yes or no answer to female knighthood. Women inherited and wielded power, raised and led armies, defended castles, and were recognized in chronicles for their martial prowess. While they might not have been tapped on the shoulder in the same way as a man, their actions, responsibilities, and societal recognition often mirrored those of a knight, challenging the rigid notion that such a figure never walked the earth.